Order, order. I call the Secretary Grant Shapps to answer the substantive question from Dr James Davis. Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to answer this question along with numbers 2 and 3. The Global Travel Task Force report clearly sets out how, when the time is right, we'll be able to restart international travel without putting our hard-won progress against the virus at risk. And we'll confirm by early May if non-essential international travel can resume from the 17th.
Let's go to Dr James Davis. James.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Comprehensive COVID testing will be critical for the safe reopening of wider international travel. We already know that countries with very low rates of COVID infection will be placed onto a green list. Can my right honourable friend confirm whether there are plans to allow individuals travelling from those countries at least to meet baseline testing requirements using lateral flow devices rather than costly PCR tests?
Secretary of State.
Well, I know my right honourable friend will agree with me. It's very important to ensure that whatever we do, we keep the British people safe. And so it is a question very much for the scientists to let us know whether or not PCR or lateral flow tests would be the appropriate tests for a day 2. However, it is the case that I'm very anxious to get the cost of those tests down. I can bring some good news to the House. There are now providers providing tests for £60 and indeed one now for £44.90.
Let's go to Brenda Sharma. Brenda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good morning. Constituents have come to me raising the issue of queues at airports. There are long waits, no food and drinks, and nowhere to sit, in some cases for 5 hours. There's totally inadequate social distancing, and arrivals from safe destinations and from red list countries are forced into the same queues all mixed together. Heathrow Airport have been clear. Border force are the problem. What conversations has the Secretary of State had with his counterpart in the Home Office about fixing this fiasco?
Well, Mr Speaker, I should remind the honourable gentleman in the House that people shouldn't be travelling right now. In fact, you cannot travel right now without a very exceptional reason indeed, because people have to stay at home, stay domestically. However, it is the case that Border Force are checking currently every single person who enters the country to make sure they've completed the pre-departure test and the locator form to say where they'll be. So I'm afraid at the moment it is the case that that inevitably creates some queues. But as we move towards the unlock of international travel, we will be addressing this issue, not least through beginning to automate the electronic e-gates with the pre-departure form.
Let's go to Julian Sturdy. Julian.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My right honourable friend will be aware that Leeds-based Jet2 have recently announced the cancellation of all flights until the 23rd of June, citing continued uncertainty about government restrictions. With the wider travel industry braced for many European holiday destinations being off limits for some time, will the Secretary of State commit to publishing detailed assessments of the categorisation of specific countries in the traffic light system so that the industry bodies are able to see if there is an immediate prospect of improvements? And also, Mr Speaker, whether he will take into account the economic value of certain European destinations to the UK travel industry.
Well, Mr Speaker, I can confirm for my honourable friend that we will be having the JBC look at 4 principal factors: the level of coronavirus in any given country, the amount of vaccines that they've dispensed in that country, the concern over any particular variant, and the quality of the data. Those are the facts and figures that they'll be looking at. But I do agree with my honourable friend about the concerns when a country jumps from one category to another, and we saw that last year. And we're taking a couple of different steps to try to help with that. One is to have a green watch list where we're able to flag up perhaps a couple of weeks in advance to say that we are looking at perhaps a variation of interest, which could turn into a variation of concern, in order to help provide a little bit more forward guidance this year.
We now come to Shadow Minister Mclean.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My friend from Ealing Southall is bang on the money today, Mr Speaker. Border Force is operating an onerous manual assurance check on inbound passengers' COVID compliance despite there being very low incidence of non-compliance and robust pre-departure checks by carriers, causing huge queues in our immigration halls. The Secretary of State opposite likes his task forces. Where is the one to alleviate these bottlenecks before our skies reopen on the 17th of May?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm somewhat confused. His honourable friend, the Shadow Transport Secretary, wants 100% quarantine, mandatory, from all countries everywhere in the world, which surely could only lead to even more problems and delays at the airport. So which is it to be, Mr. Speaker? 100% quarantine and therefore much longer queues, or a practical and rational approach which has red-list countries but also recognises that there are people who can quarantine at home? As I mentioned to his honourable friend from Ealing Southall, we are working with Border Force on electronic gates, but it's not quite as straightforward as the honourable gentleman makes out, not least because it requires both hardware and software to automate those e-gates.
Right, let's come to the Chair of the Select Committee, American.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much hope in 18 days' time that people in this country will be able to enjoy international travel once again. Can I just press him with regards to the need for a PCR test on the green list countries? Currently, those hauliers coming in from amber countries take a lateral flow test, and yet those that come back from green countries will have to have a more expensive PCR test. I recognise the need to detect mutant strains. Could I suggest to him that we require green country travellers to take a lateral flow test, and then if they're positive, then they take a PCR test so we could detect the strain? That may be a good balance to take.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do want to pay tribute to my honourable friend and his Select Committee for the excellent work that they do on this subject and many others. It is the case, of course, that, like him, I look to the scientists to provide the evidence as to what should be the appropriate level of testing at any different stage. But just to reassure him, whilst we will most likely need to start off with PCR tests, I have incorporated 3 separate checkpoints during this process, the first of which is on the 28th of June, at which we will look at the rules guiding this in order to make them as low as they can possibly be, whilst at the same time making sure that we maintain the hard-won gains of the British people in this lockdown.
Oh, brilliant, thank you.
We now have a substantive question. Minister.
Yeah, thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to answer this question along with questions 7 and 8. Through schemes such as the Beaching Reversal Fund and the National Bus Strategy, we are determined to ensure that rural areas have the transport links they need to grow and prosper. We now go to Sally Ann Hart. Sally Ann.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beautiful Hastings and Rye, with its extensive rural area and low population density, makes practical and affordable public transport difficult to provide. However, accessible and affordable transport is a lifeline for many rural residents. Transport for the South East has highlighted the need for integrated transport approaches with better integrated transport hubs to achieve efficient provision of transport services, including integration of timetables, ticketing and fares, amongst other measures. What steps is my honourable friend taking to facilitate innovation and new services in rural transport?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. We've established the Rural Mobility Fund worth £20 million to trial more demand-responsive services, and we've awarded funding to 17 pilot projects already. We've also published a call for evidence for the future of transport rural strategy, which sought views on how rural communities can benefit best from transport innovation.
Right, let us move on to the next question. David Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, my constituency has lots of the challenges you would associate with a predominantly rural area, but number 1 on my list is trying to reopen Grove Station, which in a recent survey, 98% of people supported the reopening of. We've submitted our bid to the Restore Your Railway Fund. Could my honourable friend provide an update on when we will hear, hopefully good, news?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I pay tribute to my honourable friend for his continued advocacy on behalf of his constituency, as I know this is an issue that he has raised repeatedly with ministers. The Department has received the bid for development funding. Decisions will be made by our expert panel following an initial review carried out by the Department of Transport and Network Rail. We expect to announce outcomes in the summer.
Right, let's go to Robert Larkham. Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 5 years, Andy Burnham is finally getting on with franchising bus services in Greater Manchester, and this is a step that I broadly welcome. However, there are many towns like Glossop, Hadfield and New Mills, which are just outside of Greater Manchester and rely heavily on cross-border bus services. Does the Minister agree with me that the Mayor of Greater Manchester and Derbyshire County Council need to work closely together to ensure that my constituents are not forgotten in any changes to bus services, and that we take this opportunity to improve local bus routes, including delivering a badly needed direct bus from Glossop and Hadfield to Tameside Hospital?
Minister, I'm sure the same will apply to Lancashire.
Indeed. Well, I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for being such a great champion of active travel across his constituency of High Peak. It, of course, is for the Greater Manchester Combined Authority to determine the geographical area for their franchising scheme. Local transport authorities may also join together to produce joint plans and should be looking to do so where local economies and travel to work areas overlap significantly. He makes a strong case, and I certainly hope that the local authorities in question will listen to him.
We now come to Shadow Minister Sam Tarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recent research by the Campaign to Protect Rural England has found that the last decade of government cuts has seen the loss of 134 million miles of bus coverage, leading to the creation of so-called transport deserts. Mr. Speaker, there must be proper funding for bus manufacturers who produce the vehicles that serves rural towns and villages, like Mellor in Rochdale, who I recently spoke to. They produce state-of-the-art, low-emission vehicles using many rural areas, but unfortunately victims of the big bus bias and are being excluded from the government's bus better strategy for producing vehicles at a 23 passenger capacity or less. At the same time, the Rural Mobility Fund, in the government's own words, which totals just 19.4 million, barely 1/6 of the 120 million zebra funding for zero-emission vehicles. So what assurances, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister give that the significant levels of investment will be offered to ensure that these types of companies have greater support to help them deliver the vehicles that green our industries and make sure our rural communities are genuinely connected?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There can be no greater champion of buses than the Prime Minister, who has committed us to bus back better following the pandemic. Obviously, the Prime Minister, the House will be aware that the Prime Minister announced £5 billion of funding for buses, cycling and walking. £3 billion of that is allocated to buses. And, of course, the rollout of 4,000 zero-emission buses is crucially important. We are keen to work with all manufacturers, large and small, to ensure that we get the best technology available and the best value for taxpayers and the best service for passengers.
Right, we have a substantive question to Minister Heaton-Harris.
As sole shareholder, the Secretary of State has regular discussions with the Chair and CEO of Network Rail, as do I, which obviously sometimes cover matters such as the structure and operation of that organisation.
Right, let's go to Graham Morris. Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister Heaton-Harris, for that response. I'd also like to thank Network Rail for contacting me yesterday. But can I point out that the trade unions are alarmed to hear of Network Rail's recent proposals, which could involve the loss of thousands of rail jobs and a halving of the frequency of safety-critical planned maintenance work. We certainly don't want to see any return to the cost-cutting and safety failures under rail track. Can the Minister give an assurance to the House that safety won't be compromised and any changes will be agreed with the trade unions and the regulator, who play such a vital role in protecting safety on our railways?
Yes.
Right, in which case we have another substantive question to Minister Mclean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has made financial support available through the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, the SEISS grant, which is set at 80% of 3 months' average trading profits. And the DVSA has provided trainers guidance on operating safely and testing restart dates.
Right, let's go to Rebecca Long-Bailey. Rebecca.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent wasn't self-employed. She worked supporting vaccine research during the pandemic. However, with poor public transport connections and limited income, her only option was using a moped to get to work. However, the government's failure to sufficiently extend the validity period of CBT certification during lockdown until test centres could safely reopen has sadly resulted in her being forced to leave her job. Can the Minister tell me what she will do to support essential workers like my constituent who have suffered due to the closure of training centres and a lack of extension to their certificates?
Well, I completely agree with the Honourable Lady that our frontline workers have played a vital role in the response to the pandemic, and our thanks go to all of them. She will know that it's important that learners have the right skills to drive, because safety on the road is just as important during a lockdown as it is at any other time. It's absolutely vital that up-to-date road safety knowledge is there at the critical point that they drive unsupervised for the first time. She will also know that motorcycle training resumed on the 29th of March, with testing restarting on the 12th of April in England and Wales. We did get this testing up and running. This is possible because it's easier to maintain a COVID-safe working environment for motorcyclists than for in-vehicle training and testing.
Juggen.
12.
In addition to investing £1.7 billion in 21-22 into local roads, plus an unprecedented £27 billion into the strategic road network through to 2025, we're working towards the creation of a common data standard for the monitoring of road condition. This will aim to drive innovation and flexibility in monitoring local roads, enabling authorities to target defects in their networks more quickly.
Juggen.
Thank you, Speaker. 50 of my constituents in Boatman Drive, Etruria, have been unable to access the road to their homes for over a year due to a large sinkhole which has forced Stoke-on-Trent City Council to close the road to all vehicles, including emergency services. Many of the residents have been in contact with me. One, Mr Madadi, was offered a fantastic new employment opportunity but could not accept the offer as it required relocation and his home could not sell because of the sinkhole. Will the Minister meet with me to help resolve this particular issue, which I'm sure she will agree has been going on for far too long?
Well, I commend the Honourable Lady for raising these concerns in the House in this way and standing up for her constituent. I fully understand that this is a long-running issue involving several parties, including the water utility company and the housing developer, and I completely share my honourable friend and her constituents' frustration. I would be delighted to ask my noble friend, the Roads Minister, who deals with this responsibility, to meet with her, and she's already undertaken to do so.
Shadow Minister Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I don't know if the Minister has recently visited Tory-controlled Derbyshire, but I have, and the roads are in an absolutely shocking state. Plugging potholes and patching up roads in a piecemeal fashion simply doesn't work. What we need is a proper road maintenance programme. Yet the government has slashed funding by £375 million and is ploughing £27 billion into road expansion during a climate emergency. Doesn't the Minister think that it would be better for motorists, cyclists and the planet if we focused on fixing what we've got?
Sorry, to answer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I'm delighted that the Honourable Lady enjoyed her visit to Derbyshire, and long may it continue to be Conservative-controlled. And she's wrong to say that we're not investing in local roads. The government announced £1.7 billion to tackle potholes, which includes maintenance, upgrades and to relieve congestion and boost connectivity. And I'd just like to address this allegation head-on, Mr Speaker. It's absolutely incorrect to say that the £27 billion that we're spending on road building or that 4,000 miles of new roads are planned. We're actually investing £27 billion in the operation, maintenance and renewal of England's strategic road network to secure safer and more reliable journeys that have less impact on adjacent communities and places.
No, we have a substantive question.
My department is investing an unprecedented £2 billion in active travel over the course of this Parliament. This is the biggest ever boost for cycling and walking.
Right, let's go to Dr Neil Hudson. Neil.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In Cumbria, we are spoilt for choice when it comes to walking and cycling routes, such as the Hadrian's Wall Trail, Coast to Coast and countless Wainwrights. As well as being hugely important for physical and mental health, many businesses in my constituency depend on tourism, and by encouraging visitors, it will assist the recovery of these businesses. Does my honourable friend agree that now is a great time to enjoy the beautiful Cumbrian countryside by walking and cycling, and that longer-term projects like reopening Gillsland railway station will improve the accessibility and connectivity of our region, which will make these activities easier to enjoy?
Yes, I absolutely do encourage people to cycle and walk in Cumbria, and indeed I welcome the bid for funding from Gillsland Station, and visited it only last Thursday to see what it looks like for myself. We'll announce in due course whether the bid has been successful, but if successful, it will unlock funding for the production. The money will unlock funding for a strategic outline business case that could see fantastic development at a station that has huge potential for tourism and other things.
Minister, another substantive.
We are working with the rail industry to develop a number of recovery initiatives focused on restoring passenger confidence in travelling by rail.
Right, let's go to Tony Lloyd. Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Minister that yes, any steps to encourage people post-COVID to regard rail travel as safe have got to be welcomed. But would you recognise the very poor quality of the train service between Rochdale and Manchester, for example, a major commuter route? Poor quality trains, unreliable service is a handicap both to commuters but also to the economic development of the town of Rochdale. What is going to be done about this in the short term? We need the government to act.
Yeah, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and actually a huge amount is being done whilst there are fewer passengers on our network. When passengers return to travelling, hopefully as they previously did, between Rochdale and Manchester, I'd like to think they will not find a Pacer train being used, because they have been replaced by new fleet. I'd like to think they'd find these trains in spotless conditions, because they are unbelievably clean. And also we're working on there's been a big consultation that he will know about trying to sort out some of the very, very big structural problems that we have with infrastructure such as the Castlefield corridor and the timetabling of trains through it, where we're trying to have a short and medium and long-term solutions to this very thorny problem, which will guarantee much better service in the long run.
Senator Minister Tammy Chin.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, the government's approach to recovering our railways is chaotic. They have introduced inflation-busting rail fares while freezing fuel duty. They talk about the green agenda, yet fail to commit to a rolling programme of electrification. They talk about levelling up, but have put into doubt dozens of key rail infrastructure projects. They brought franchises back into public ownership just to pay risk-free profits to private companies. And, Mr. Speaker, where are the flexible season tickets for cash-strapped passengers? All hidden, no doubt, in the long-promised Williams Review, which never seems to arrive. So my question to the Minister is simple. Doesn't the British public deserve much better than this?
Well, I don't recognise the picture the honourable gentleman has painted. We have electrified way more miles of rail than any previous Labour government. But actually, there's a huge amount of money that's going into our rail system at this point in time. The government has stood behind the railways to the tune it'll be near £12 billion over the course of the last year. Money that would not have been able to be spent under a Labour administration, because the economy would have been in tatters and we would have been in a very different place.
Substantive question to Minister Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I would like to answer this question along with question number 18. The Department for Transport engages regularly with FCDO, the devolved administrations and the cruise industry on the Global Travel Task Force and Cruise Restart. Travel advice is the responsibility of the FCDO.
Right, let's go to Ronnie Cowan. Ronnie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituency of Inverclyde hosts over 80 visits from international cruise ships each year. They make a valued contribution to the local economy, and when the time is right, we look forward to welcoming them back. However, with health to the fore, can the Minister tell me how the travel regime operates under the traffic light system with countries that have emerging variants of concern or a prevalent spread of variants, and in what ways will the government seek to react in good time to prevent transmission?
The honourable member is quite right to draw attention to the huge economic importance of the cruise industry to constituencies like Inverclyde. My department continues to work closely with the FCDO and with the Department for Health and Social Care. There is a COVID-19 framework drawn up by the cruise industry which informs health protocols on board those ships. That's been recognised as good practice by the UN's International Maritime Organisation. We will see a safe restart of international cruises in accordance with those protocols.
Let's go to Caroline Noakes. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The cruise industry is a significant employer in the Southampton area, but British travellers are still advised by the FCDO against cruising, even as advice on flying is set to be relaxed along with ease restrictions. Approval has been given for domestic cruising, but please can my honourable friend work with colleagues across government to make sure that international travel advice for cruising is aligned with that for aviation.
My honourable friend's quite right. The home port call is estimated to generate approximately £2.95 million in today's money, which underlines the critical importance for cruises for employment in Southampton and other ports. The restart of domestic cruises has indeed been confirmed, and the GTT advises that international cruises will restart alongside the wider restart of international travel. I am committed to working with colleagues at the FCDO and across government to see a safe restart of international cruises as soon as is possible, in line with the GTT.
We have a substantive question to the Secretary of State from Jamie Stone.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The responsibility for bus services is a devolved matter. My department engages with the devolved administrations, including Scotland, on issues of bus services all the time.
Let's go to Jamie Stone. Jamie.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I live near an Asda store, and many of the people who work there, who are friends of mine, would like to use the local bus services to get to work, but the timetables don't work. Equally, I have people living in Caithness who are disabled who'd like to use the buses to Inverness-more, but the disabled facilities are not what they are, or what they should be. I've made representations to the Scottish Government and to the bus company Stagecoach, but to no avail. I do realise, of course, that transport is devolved, but what advice can the Secretary of State offer me to try and sort this wretched problem out?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the honourable gentleman's quite right. It is a devolved matter, but there are Barnet consequentials. So there's quite a lot of money coming through, in particular from the Bus Back Better plan. But he's also right to be concerned, as I've been, about the level of bus services and threatened cuts across Scotland, including First Bus in Glasgow and Stagecoach in Stirling. So I would encourage him to work hard to highlight these issues and remind the Scottish Government that they do have a lot of money for buses coming through as a result of Barnet consequentials.
20 withdrawn, so we go to Kevin Holland.
21, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government recognises that good access to airports is essential and is happy to work with airports, transport bodies and local authorities to bring improvements where needed.
Kevin Holland.
Thank you. Vital plans to expand Leeds Bradford Airport have been delayed due to planning matters, and I realise my honourable friend can't comment on planning matters, but does he agree that expansion of airports in Yorkshire, which is very underserved in terms of airport capacity, are vitally important for the economy and for leisure opportunities for people in Yorkshire?
My honourable friend is quite right that I am unable to comment on specific planning case at Leeds Bradford Airport so as not to prejudice any consideration of that proposal. This government has been clear that it's supportive of airports making best use of their existing runways, and it fully understands and values the critical connecting role of regional aviation.
Substantive question to Secretary of State from Drew.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question along with question number 23. The Transport Decarbonisation Plan will set out transport contributions to net zero, and we continue to work with our international partners ahead of COP26.
Let's go to Drew Hendry. Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Promoting and investing in cycling and in active travel is essential if we are to reduce car journeys. The Scottish Government already spends over £15 per person, compared with just over £7 in England, twice as much, more than twice as much. The SNP have pledged to increase this investment to over 10% of the transport capital budget. Does the Minister agree that this is the sort of ambition required to drive real change, and will his government commit to replicating this in England?
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman giving me an opportunity to talk about our active travel plans with £2 billion worth of spending. Of course, the Barnett consequentials from that, which will no doubt give him something to boast about in future, but invented in Downing Street and, I hope, delivered in Scotland.
Let's go to Douglas Chapman. Douglas.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shipping is a significant contributor to carbon emissions and pollutions around the world. We all know that change is coming, but what is required now is investment and incentives. So what support will his department provide to those in our maritime and shipping sectors as part of the government's commitment to moving towards net zero shipping?
Mr. Speaker, that's absolutely right, and the shipping industry is one of the harder to decarbonise areas of the economy. However, technologies like hydrogen, for example, have a big part to play, and so this government's putting a lot of R&D investment behind hydrogen in particular, with a view to shipping. We've just announced the Teesside Hub, a hydrogen hub, the country's first, to help develop more of those technologies, and through our transport decarbonisation plan, the honourable gentleman will not be disappointed by our ambition.
Governor Newlands, SNP spokesperson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we've heard, the government is finally inching forward with a fraction of its 4,000 green bus plan, but in Scotland orders have already been placed for the equivalent of 2,728 battery electric buses, with many more to come. At the Transport Committee, Baroness Veer called this investment brilliant. Graham Vidler of the CPT also welcomed it, plus the £5 billion equivalent on bus infrastructure, and called the Scottish Government's commitment on reducing car journeys by 20% by decade's end a big, bold and ambitious target that we would like to see matched in the UK Government's decarbonisation plan. Will you match it, Secretary of State?
Once again, I'm very pleased that the Barnett consequentials ensure that there is money available to spend in Scotland, and I think we should welcome the fact that there's £3 billion going into buses. He mentions the £120 million that we've announced for zero-emission buses in 21-22, which will give many hundreds of buses the start of the production line, and we are indeed on target to deliver all 4,000 that we've promised to start building in this Parliament.
Come on, Gavin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's not what the industry says, and the gap in ambition is simply startling. The SNP plans to have the majority of fossil fuel buses removed from service by 2023. This government's plans represent just 1/10 of the English fleet. When you consider this, along with commitments in action on decarbonisation, on rail decarbonisation with a nationalised ScotRail, increasing the active travel budget to 10% of transport capital, free bikes for children who can't afford them, interest-free loans for electric cars and free bus travel for under-22s, does you agree with me that if Scots want that progressive and decarbonised future, that has to be both votes SNP next Thursday?
Well, funny enough, Mr. Speaker, I don't agree, and it's worth his Scottish voters understanding that money is available through the Barnett consequentials. And if it were the case that the bus services were as good as was claimed, then it wouldn't be the case that in Dundee bus users have been warned just last November to expect big changes to services, the worst since the 1950s, which had negative impacts for older people and those dependent on bus services. So I don't think it's quite as rosy as the honourable gentleman likes to make it sound. But this government in Westminster is committed to decarbonising the whole of the United Kingdom.
Let's get beyond next Thursday. It'll be easier for all of us. We now have a substantive question to the Secretary of State.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question along with 28. The government does not support a boundary charge. The Mayor of London cannot expect non-Londoners to clean up his mismanagement of TfL finances.
Let's go to David Simmons. David.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that this is precisely not the fresh start that TfL or London as a whole needs to see? The cost of the Mayor's financial mismanagement should not be passed on to my constituents and other Londoners at precisely the time when we're trying to kickstart our economy after COVID. Does he agree with me that this, if implemented, would be damaging, particularly for high streets in outer London boroughs, and especially to the disabled and those who rely on their cars for personal reasons?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's absolutely right. I mean, let's be fair to the Mayor of London. No one could have predicted the coronavirus. This government has generously backed TfL with more than £3 billion of support so far. But it is because of the Mayor's mismanagement of that organisation, with years of being woefully unprepared, that he wasn't ready when this economic shock came. And if London wants a real fresh start for TfL, doesn't want this boundary tax, they should consider voting for Sean Bailey on May the 6th.
Sir David Everett. Sir David.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that the proposed charge is a result of the London Labour Mayor's poor financial management, and that this reckless charge would have severe detrimental effects on businesses, employees, families, shoppers and visitors in outer London boroughs like mine of Bexley?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend's absolutely right to highlight the threat. And I wonder whether everybody realises that the Mayor of London would like to introduce this border tax so that non-Londoners end up having to pay for his financial mismanagement of London. It's not on. It's called taxation without representation. As our American cousins used to point out, that's tyranny.
Right, we have a substantive question to Minister Heaton Harris.
The Leamside line is being assessed as part of Northern Powerhouse Rail and will be considered within the integrated rail plan.
Let's go to Sharon Hodgson. Sharon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As he said, the proposal to reopen the Leamside line in full is being considered as part of the integrated rail plan. Now, we were told to expect an answer in March, then it was April, and now we are almost in May without any further news. So when will my constituents expect to find out if this government intends to follow through on its promise to level up from Westminster to Wearside?
Oh, we certainly intend to follow through on our promises to the people in the North East and Wearside, something that decades of Labour disinterest in that area have failed to deliver. Ahead of finalising the integrated rail plan, we are fully considering the evidence from all stakeholders. We've had an awful lot. And I'd just like to remind the Honourable Lady, who I know does support this scheme, but this scheme was driven by local campaigners at the start with a guy called Christopher Howarth, who was a Conservative campaigner, and there was little interest from her party or its representatives before he got involved.
Right. Substantive question to Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Significant improvements are being planned and delivered at pace. And, of course, on the 6th of May, the people of Wales will be able to vote for a Welsh Conservative government committed to working with us to deliver even further rail infrastructure improvements.
Let's go to Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. I was disappointed to receive an answer from the Department to a written question indicating the Labour government of my country had not made any formal representations to the British government regarding the proposed West Wales Parkway on the main line. However, whilst I fully support the project, we need to be far more ambitious. It could form part of a transformational metro system for the west of Wales, centred on Swansea City, by linking up the whole Western Coalfield valleys and beyond. Considering the manner HS2 is shafting Wales, will the British government compensate the communities I represent so that a comprehensive public transport revolution can be delivered for South West Wales?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as the honourable gentleman will know, this government is committed to delivering the West Wales Parkway station. Indeed, it was in the 2019 Conservative Party manifesto. So we continue to work with all local partners to deliver this, and it is currently being progressed to outline business case stage using regional funding.
Right. We have a substantive question to Minister Heaton Harris.
We are making stations more accessible, improving staff training and passenger assistance. The disabled person's rail card reduces fares, and better accessible trains are coming into service.
Let's go to Navadu, Misha. Navadu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, only 40% of railway stations in Greater Manchester have step-free access. That is 38 out of 93 stations. This is significantly lower than the North West region as a whole, which is at 63%, and the national average at 61%. Mayor Andy Burnham has called for all railway stations in Greater Manchester to be fully accessible by 2025. According to the charity Leonard Cheshire, it would take just 1 to 3% of annual transport spending to make the rail network accessible by 2030. So what steps has he taken to ensure this is a reality as soon as possible?
Yeah, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question and his interest in this. This government is spending hundreds of millions of pounds in improving our network and continues to do so. Indeed, I met yesterday with the Chief Executive of Network Rail to talk about how we can speed up the delivery of elements of our accessibility programme. I did read the Leonard Cheshire report into this, and it was interesting, but I tend to think that they have underestimated the figures involved in improving our network to the level it should be at by now.
A substantive question to Minister Mclean.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We are working to finalise our bold and ambitious plan to decarbonise transport, and we expect to publish it as soon as possible this spring.
Let's go to Mick Whitley. Mick.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government's Brexit deal means that in order to avoid tariffs on electric vehicles, 55% of vehicle parts, including batteries, will need to be locally sourced by the end of 2026. Will the government back Labour's call for investments in at least 3 battery gigafactories by 2025? And can the government commit to building one of those factories on Merseyside?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and he's absolutely right that a gigafactory will play a critical role in decarbonising our transport system. We have world-beating automotive industry in this country, and at the election the government committed £1 billion to back investment into a gigafactory into this country. And can I remind the honourable gentleman that actually leaving the European Union has provided us with a lot of opportunities to set our own pathways to decarbonise transport, and we will be setting out those plans in detail in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. The Department aims to create more free-flowing journeys across the strategic road network, including the A1, through its road investment.
Sir Woodley.
The A1, the Great North Road, is a beautiful road linking Scotland and England, and I think that to honour the upcoming Jubilee, we should rename it the Queen's Highway. Why not? But it's not an entirely safe road. I've spent hundreds of hours on it. There are many fatalities on it. I can't understand why all the roundabouts have been stripped away between Newark and Black Cat, but going south from Black Cat roundabout to the North Circular, there are still roundabouts. There are many crossing points in Lincolnshire and other places. So will the Minister now commit to really upgrading the A1 to make it entirely safe, get rid of all the traffic lights, the roundabouts, the crossing points, and let's make it a true Queen's Highway?
Well, I thank my honourable friend very much, and I fully agree with his suggestion for renaming this beautiful road as he sets out. And I'm sure that the Transport Secretary, who's listening carefully, will take that away and consider it. But I'm happy to say to my right honourable friend that we are investing significant sums in making the A1 safer and more reliable. As a result of our near £1 billion A428 improvement scheme, there will be a major reconstruction of the Black Cat Junction on the A1 so that north-south traffic will flow freely underneath it. And there is potential for further enhancement along the A1, and that will be considered in the light of Highways England's work to update its route strategies starting this year. And I fully expect my honourable friend's journeys to be very, very pleasant indeed in the future.
In which case, we're going to go to topicals. Chris Matheson.
Topical number 1, sir.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that the House is interested in the updates with regard to travel returning internationally over the coming months, and I wanted to provide a very quick update to say that although PCR tests may be required from a medical scientific point of view, we have been working with private laboratories and pharmacies, supermarkets and other companies to encourage them to deliver on their logistical expertise and enter the market and drive down the cost. And we've seen some success so far, Mr. Speaker, because, as I mentioned earlier, the cost of a single PCR day 2 test now has come down to £60 from one of the large providers on the government-linked site, with a new entrant now at £44.90 enabling more people to access PCR tests as international travel returns.
Christian Matheson.
Speaker, I understand that work on the strategic outline business case for the redevelopment of Chester Station submitted to the Department has produced a highly positive cost-benefit rate ration, and it's also been proposed as a priority project for the DFT acceleration unit supported by Transport for the North. So can the Secretary of State confirm when Chester Station will be included in the rail network enhancement programme and when further development funding will be allocated to take this project forward?
So I thank the honourable gentleman. We're continuing to work very closely with Cheshire West and Chester councils on their preparations of the strategic outline business case for enhancements at and around Chester Station. And having received an initial strategic outline business case from the council last summer, DFT officials undertook a detailed review of the requested further information for the SOBC and being considered potentially for included in RNEP or the, well, you know what RNEP is. I won't explain. Thank you.
Royston Smith. Speaker, the active travel grant funding made available to local authorities such as mine in Southampton was very welcome. Unfortunately, the Labour-run council in Southampton has used this funding to half road capacity on main arterial routes into the city. As lockdown has eased, this has caused congestion and made already poor air quality much worse. Would my honourable friend confirm that the active travel funding provided to local authorities did not come with directions about how it will be used, and the decisions to implement any schemes for good or ill are the responsibility of the local authority?
Minister.
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We in the Department for Transport have made it utterly clear that local authorities must focus on scheme quality. They must demonstrate that they have carried out appropriate consultation. They must demonstrate that they've listened to local communities, considered the access for emergency vehicles and also traffic impacts. We recognise that poorly designed temporary cycling and walking schemes can have negative impacts, but we do also recognise that they can be very, very positive when they're delivered in the right way.
Let's go to the Shadow Secretary of State, Jim McMahon. Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After much delay, the Transport Secretary has finally published Highway England's review into smart motorways. The stocktake has revealed that over the last 5 years, 63 people have lost their lives, a significant increase on the 38 figure given just over a year ago. Victims' families and campaigners are crying out for common sense, crying out for action from the Secretary of State, recognising that the radar technology doesn't even capture broken down vehicles 35% of the time. As the legal challenge mounts, will he publish the specific data which compares deaths on the hard shoulder of existing motorways to the deaths on the lane that was previously a hard shoulder and is now used as a live running lane?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable gentleman and I and the whole House share similar concerns about the safety of our motorways, and one of the first things I did as Secretary of State was introduce the stocktake into smart motorways. One of the factors that we have to look at is the level of fatalities on both smart motorways and regular motorways. And as I mentioned to him previously, in the period 2015 to 19, there were 39 fatalities on smart motorways, but there were also 368 fatalities on regular motorways. I think it's very important that we look at all the questions that he asked with regard to the data, and that is why I've asked the Office of Rail and Road to analyse the data and provide reassurance that it can be trusted. And when those figures are provided, we can therefore compare them in a comparative sense to make sure that we are producing the safest possible roads in the world.
Let's go back to Jim McMahon. Jim.
The victims' families want to know that action will be taken on those lives that are avoidably lost. And I'm afraid that won't satisfy victim families at all. Mr. Speaker, moving on to our regional economies. The Secretary of State knows how important our regional airports are to providing jobs in the tens of thousands in our regions, important, well-paid, decent jobs. Will he make sure the government do far more than the standard schemes on business rates, on furlough support, to make sure that our regional airports don't just survive, but can thrive in the future? Or does he believe that the market will decide their fate?
Well, Mr. Speaker, just to reference back to, I understand that it's the honourable gentleman's policy, Labour's policy, to close the all-running lanes, which would create more traffic, and the current estimate is it would create 25% more traffic on other roads. That in itself would, we think, expect to produce about 25 more fatalities per year. So I do urge the honourable gentleman to follow the work of the Office of Rail and Road to make sure that what we do is not to create more fatalities rather than fewer. With regard to regional airports, he's absolutely right. We do need to support them. We have put £7 billion into protecting and supporting our aviation sector. I'm slightly mystified, though, because I understand the honourable gentleman's current policy, if I understand it correctly, is in fact to quarantine all current traffic, so that nobody would be able to quarantine at home, which would do further damage to our regional airports.
Mr Speaker, I'm delighted that North Devon is soon to become home to the first rural e-scooter trial. However, what steps is my right honourable friend taking to inform the public that e-scooters already seen in so many public spaces are not legally permitted unless part of the trial?
Minister.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend very much for her support for this innovative form of transport technology. Trials of rental e-scooters, which began last July, have been a huge success. Over 2 million trips have been taken, 5 million kilometres ridden. That's the equivalent of 6 times to the moon and back, Mr Speaker. But the Department has written to all major retailers of e-scooters in the UK to ask them to make it clear to customers that e-scooters are illegal to use on public roads. Retailers make this clear online and in their stores, and motoring offences will apply to the private use of e-scooters, and the local police are fully engaged and they have enforcement powers and they are expected to use them.
Let's go to Hilary Benn. Hilary.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Given that the National Infrastructure Bank is going to be based in Leeds, wouldn't it be highly symbolic to start building Phase 2B of the eastern leg of HS2 from Leeds southwards? The Secretary of State was quoted recently as saying he's looking at bringing forward the start date. I wonder whether he would consider this idea.
Well, Mr Speaker, I actually agree with the right honourable gentleman. It probably would have been sensible to start the entire project from the north-south in the first place. However, having looked at this in great detail, not least through the Oakervie review, I also know chopping and changing those plans part way through is the most expensive possible outcome and doesn't work out. Nonetheless, we are committed to ensuring that the integrated rail plan answers all these questions, and his point has been very clearly heard.
Let's go to Dr Dan Poulter. Dan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware that almost 50% of the UK container freight goes through Felixstowe Port, and of the importance of improving rail links from that port to the Midlands and the North. So can I get his reassurance that the Felixstowe to Nuneaton freight rail link is a priority for this government and will be delivered on time?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the importance of the freight links in our country. And since 2009, over £200 million has been invested in capacity on the Felixstowe to Nuneaton freight corridor. And through the Rail Network Enhancements Pipeline, Network Rail is developing business cases for enhancements at Ely, Hockley and between Ely and Soham to provide additional capacity on this key freight corridor.
Let's go to Alison Thulis. Alison.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Constituents of mine who had travelled for essential medical treatment for their disabled children were required to hotel quarantine at Heathrow in a hotel room completely inadequate for their needs. So can I ask what consideration is being given to the needs of disabled people and those with medical needs in the hotel quarantine scheme?
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right to stand up for her constituents, particularly those who may have special circumstances, and there is a process in place for special circumstances to be considered. I'd be interested to understand why, in the case of her constituent, by her response, it doesn't look like it was effective, and we'd be very happy to investigate that particular case, although I understand it would, of course, be retrospective.
Great to see the member back. Tracy Crouch.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Representing a constituency in a county which has a large number of commuters to London, the future of flexible rail ticketing is an issue many are paying close attention to. With the reality of more people enjoying hybrid working arrangements in the future, we need to ensure this is reflected in the structure of rail tickets. Therefore, could the Secretary of State confirm when the Department will be in a position to set out what rail ticketing will look like for passengers in my constituency and across the South East, and provide an assurance that the new fares will offer genuine flexibility where it is needed?
Of everybody, how fantastic it is to see our honourable friend back in the House in her rightful place. She's absolutely right as well about the changes in the way that people will commute going forward, because the world has, of course, changed. And I'm sure people are going to come back to the railway, but perhaps in a more flexible way. And I can reassure her we'll be setting out more details of our view about how ticketing should work, not least through the William Shapps review.
Let's go to Manira Wilson. Manira.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the government's sixth carbon budget included aviation emissions for the first time, a welcome step. So could the Secretary of State explain how the government thinks it can hit its net zero target without updating the airport's national policy statement? And will he finally commit to scrapping Tory plans for a third runway at Heathrow if he's serious about tackling the climate emergency?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady very much for her question, and she will know that the whole House voted for the Heathrow plans, as she stated. But we will shortly be bringing forward our transport decarbonisation plans, which will discuss in full and in detail our ambitious plans to decarbonise the entire transport sector, including the aviation sector. She's right to say that we've increased our ambition on this front, and we are the only major leading nation who is going to set out such an ambitious set of plans to decarbonise the entire sector.
Let's go to Catherine Fletcher. Catherine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hello from Lancashire. In South Ribble, there's quite a lot of interest in the government's recently announced £3 billion national bus strategy. Speaking to residents, many improvement suggestions have already been received. So Joanne, for example, wants a west-east bus between Tarleton, the Hulls, Longton, and getting into Leyland. Can my right honourable friend share how he plans to ensure that the community's voices are heard during the planning of this strategy, so their needs are in the mix, and it's not just the ideas from the men in grey suits and the established industry?
Of travel when you do in Lancashire, Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've noted your remark, and I thank the Honourable Lady very much for her point. And as someone who's not a man in a grey suit, I can completely reassure her fully and thank her for the massively constructive way she's engaged with the National Bus Strategy since its launch. The way she stood up for her constituents is absolutely exemplary, and I know from discussions that I've had with her how important this is. By October, local transport authorities are expected to provide bus service improvement plans, which should be developed in collaboration with local people to ensure they genuinely reflect the area's needs.
Right, staying in Lancashire. Rosie Cooper. Come on, Rosie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents are concerned that each of the three rail timetabling options put forward by the Manchester Recovery Task Force mean reduced connectivity between West Lancs and Manchester. Will the Secretary of State assure my constituents that they are not the poor relations of the larger northern cities, and will he intervene to ensure that a supposed levelling up of services in the north does not leave areas like West Lancs behind?
Yes, that's absolutely right. I've been working with Transport for the North and many others in consultation to sort out that fundamental problem, which is the bottleneck around the Castleford corridor and in and out of Manchester, which impacts on the entire northern rail service and beyond. So she's absolutely right to say we will be taking all those representations into account very carefully indeed. The rail minister would gladly meet with the Honourable Lady to discuss further.
Right. Let's go to Natalie Elphick.
Speaker, when direct all-day high-speed services to Martin Mill, Deal and Sandwich were suspended, I received written assurances that they would be fully restored after lockdown. Can my right honourable friend confirm that it remains the intention to fully restore the high-speed services to Deal, Sandwich and the villages as soon as possible?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Morning and evening peak services to Martin Mill, Kingsdown, Deal and Sandwich are currently operating. Passenger volumes are continually monitored. All-day service provision will be reviewed in light of passenger demand as lockdown restrictions are eased.
Right. Let us now go to Paul Blomfield. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will know that the consultation on Manchester rail services is considering the removal of the direct link between Sheffield and Manchester Airport. Our Chamber of Commerce are deeply concerned about the damage to local business and jobs from accessing the service, Our two world-class universities believe it will threaten international student recruitment, which brings in more than £200 million to the local economy. Does the Secretary of State recognise those concerns, and will he meet with me and local members to discuss the issue?
Yes, I absolutely recognise the concerns. As I mentioned in the answer a moment or two ago, there is a problem with congestion around the Manchester area on the rail services, which does need to be resolved, and I'm working with all of the local partners to do so. I've actually set up a Northern Transport Acceleration Council, or NTAC, meeting, a special meeting of NTAC, for after the elections in order to work with the Manchester Recovery Task Force to resolve exactly this issue.
15 withdrawn, so I'm going to Lillian Greenwood. Lillian.
Between January and June last year, the Minister of State told the House 3 times that his department would shortly publish its research on the level of funding needed to meet the targets of doubling cycling and increasing walking by 2025. Will he now publish this missing research, or is he breaking his promise because he knows that it confirms the funding allocated falls woefully short of what's needed?
Well, given that we've got £2 billion of funding for walking and cycling, the biggest ever sum invested, as far as we can work out, into active travel, the idea that it's a lack of investment is, of course, entirely untrue. Last year, the Honourable Lady will have noticed that the coronavirus had occupied almost everything that we were doing, but it didn't prevent us from issuing a new cycling strategy, published by the Prime Minister and backed by me. We'll be saying a lot more about this, and I welcome her enthusiasm.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Environment, I'm incredibly supportive of the government's ambition to phase out diesel trains across the entire UK network by 2040. And East West Rail is soon to build a railway line in my constituency, due for completion in 2030. But it isn't being built as an electrified line, and my constituents are very worried they might end up with a new diesel railway line. Will my honourable friend, or right honourable friend, I'm not sure who's answering, work with me and the Treasury to make sure that East West Rail is aligned with the government's ambition to phase out diesel trains?
Answer my honourable friend. East West Rail, the company behind the new line, are aiming to deliver an entirely zero-carbon railway, and will be considering conventional and emerging technology solutions for powering trains, which could be part electric and part hydrogen or battery in the future, for example, that the services operate along the whole length of the route are zero carbon.
An ultimate question, Jim Shannon.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah. Sometimes I forget I'm wearing the mask, Mr. Speaker, but can I thank you very much for letting me in. Airlines have had a difficult last 12 months. Belfast City Airport, Belfast International Airport and Londonderry Airport are important Northern Ireland regional airports. Can the Minister confirm government support for them, which I know has been there, and that every effort to ensure that they can and will be part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland strategy for the future? Thank you.
Yes, that's right, Mr. Speaker, and the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to point out the importance of those links with our Northern Ireland airports. I made sure that we put public service obligations in place during the height of the crisis last year, and we'll always be looking to do everything that we can to make sure that connectivity between our great union continues to exist.
Right, we now come to the final question for Ginny Crosby.
Speaker, cutting-edge maritime projects, the Holyhead Hydrogen Hub and the proposed Anglesey Freeport in my constituency of Anismore will move forward this government's renewable agenda. To take full advantage of these opportunities, excellent transport infrastructure is needed across North Wales. Will the Minister confirm he will support necessary improvements to the A55 as highlighted in Sir Peter Henry's Union Connectivity Review?
Well, my honourable friend is a brilliant champion of connectivity for her constituency, and as a result of that, my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, was in North Wales earlier this week discussing plans to upgrade the A55 with the Welsh Conservative candidate standing in May's election. And we look forward to the final Union Connectivity Review recommendations ahead of the spending review, where we will consider funding plans for delivering improved UK-wide connectivity. But I must say to the honourable lady, the fastest way for her constituents to secure upgrades to the A55 is to vote for the Welsh Conservative government, who have pledged to end Labour's neglect of North Wales.
Which brings me on to my final point, just to say I'll be pleased when next Thursday is out of the way. But can I just remind members, those MPs that are going into other constituencies, other than a private personal visit, please ensure that you notify the MP. And that goes to all sides, because I'm getting letters of complaints. Please, I don't need any more letters of complaints. Just abide by good practice. Point of order, David Davis.
A further letter of complaint, Mr. Speaker. I want to raise with you the problem of government departments not meeting the guidelines for name-day questions. To put it in context, this government spends more money on polling and focus groups than any government in history. And there may be good reason for that, but for the last year they have resisted adamantly all freedom of information requests about that subject. So I put in 5 name-day questions on specific elements of it. Not one of them was answered on time. Indeed, not one of them has been answered yet. This is not unusual. Other departments also resist answering name-day questions, and this is an instrument which is critical for holding governments to account. This was the Cabinet Office, but other departments do the same. Mr. Speaker, can I ask you to get the House authorities to speak to the government about meeting these guidelines so that our attempts to hold them to account are more effective?
Can I just say, I totally agree with everything that the right honourable gentleman has said. It is not acceptable, and unfortunately we haven't got business questions, because I do know that the Leader of the House is also concerned, like both of us, that questions need to be answered. We have a procedure, we have a process that Secretaries of State and Ministers have to take seriously. It is totally unacceptable. We are elected by our constituents expect a service, and that service is being denied by ministerial departments. Well, it's not acceptable. We'll continue to take it up. But what I would say to Secretary of State, I wouldn't like to cross the honourable gentleman, because I know this won't be the end of it. I'm sure that he's already on to the Procedure Committee to let them know of his dissatisfaction. But I'm dissatisfied. The message needs to go to the heart of government. Take MPs seriously from all sides. They deserve the service. So do their constituents. Not acceptable. Let's keep in touch on it. Right, we have a little bit more now. Order, order. The sitting is suspended. And shortly before the sitting resumes, I shall call the division bells, and they will be sounded. Thanks, everybody.